The first clue wasn't the HOA logo on my front door. It was the smell of fresh coffee coming from a lake house that should have been completely empty. I remember standing there with my duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, listening to the faint hum of a laser printer somewhere inside my family's lake house. For a second, I honestly thought I had pulled into the wrong driveway. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked closer. The late afternoon sun reflected off the water, turning the surface of Lake Holloway into a sheet of gold. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered it except for one detail. My lake house had somehow become HOA headquarters. A white vinyl sign was mounted beside the front steps. Willow Creek Shores Homeowners Association Administrative Office. I stared at those words for several seconds, convinced my exhausted brain was playing tricks on me. 8 months. I'd been away for 8 months overseeing a flood control project in Montana. 8 months of 12-hour shifts, motel rooms, construction reports, and counting down the days until I could finally come back to the one place that had always felt like home. The lake house wasn't some vacation property I'd bought on a whim. My grandfather built it with his own hands in 1974. Every cedar beam, every floorboard, every stone in the fireplace carried his fingerprints. I learned how to fish off that dock. I learned how to drive a boat on that lake. My father taught me how to repair an engine in the detached workshop behind the house. Every memory that mattered seemed to live somewhere on that property. And now there was a sign on my front porch claiming it belonged to the HOA. A burst of laughter echoed from inside. Then another. The sound was followed by the rhythmic clicking of computer keyboards. I walked closer to one of the windows and glanced through the blinds. What I saw nearly made me laugh from the sheer absurdity of it. My grandfather's dining room table was covered with laptops, filing trays, and stacks of paperwork. The old wooden hutch that used to display family photographs now held binders with HOA labels. 3 people sat around the table discussing landscaping violations while sipping coffee from branded HOA mugs. My lake house had become their office. The air felt strangely still. Even the gentle waves tapping against the shoreline seemed quieter than usual. I spotted 2 golf carts parked beside the dock. Both carried HOA decals on the doors. One of them was parked directly on top of the stone pathway my grandfather had built 40 years earlier. That's when I noticed something else. The front door lock was different. The original brass deadbolt was gone. In its place sat a modern electronic keypad lock. I walked up the steps and ran my hand across it. Cold metal. Brand new. Someone had removed my lock and installed their own. On my house. The metallic taste of disbelief settled on my tongue. You ever experience something so ridiculous that your brain refuses to process it? That's exactly how it felt. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was too confused. Too fascinated. I kept looking around, expecting someone to jump out and explain the joke. But nobody did. The place was operating exactly like a legitimate business office. Through the window, I watched a woman walk across the room, carrying a box of printer paper. Another person was hanging a framed HOA certificate on a wall that had once displayed photographs of my grandparents. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the screen door. The low murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle buzz of electronics. It felt like I was watching strangers slowly rewrite my family's history in real time. Then I saw her. Diane Whitmore, HOA President. 54 years old. Perfect blonde hair. Perfect white pantsuit. Perfect smile. The kind of smile that looked friendly from a distance, but somehow managed to feel insulting up close. She stepped into what used to be my grandfather's living room and began directing people around like a corporate executive opening a new branch office. She pointed toward the fireplace. My grandfather's fireplace. Then she nodded approvingly as someone carried another box of documents into the room. That was the exact moment I realized this wasn't temporary. They weren't borrowing the space. They weren't holding a meeting. They genuinely believed they owned it. And standing there on the front porch of my own lake house, listening to them conduct HOA business behind a lock I had never authorized, I suddenly understood something important. They had made a very expensive mistake. I stayed on the porch for another minute, letting the reality settle in while the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar and lake water across the property. The smell had not changed since I was a kid. That was the strange part. Everything that mattered was still here. The dock stretched 30 feet into the water exactly where my grandfather built it. The old boathouse still leaned slightly to the left after surviving 4 decades of storms. The massive oak tree near the shoreline still cast a shadow across the yard every afternoon. Yet somehow strangers had managed to make the entire place feel foreign. My grandfather, Walter Walker, bought this land in 1972 when nobody wanted lake property out here. Back then, the nearest grocery store was 20 miles away, and most people thought the shoreline was too isolated to be worth much. He disagreed. He spent 2 years building the Lakehouse himself after finishing long shifts at a paper mill. Family photographs still show him standing on unfinished floor joists with a hammer hanging from his belt and sawdust covering his work boots. He was not a wealthy man. He was simply stubborn. Every paycheck went into lumber, roofing materials, plumbing supplies, and whatever else the project needed. My father used to joke that Grandpa built the house one paycheck at a time. When I was 8 years old, he taught me how to skip stones from the end of the dock. When I was 12, he trusted me to steer his fishing boat for the first time. By 16, I could practically rebuild the old outboard motor blindfolded. Some families passed down jewelry or antiques. Mine passed down property lines, maintenance records, and stories connected to every inch of shoreline. That lake house became the center of every major memory in my life. Birthdays, holidays, summer weekends, quiet mornings before sunrise. It was where my father taught me responsibility and where my grandfather taught me patience. When both of them passed away, ownership transferred directly to me through a family trust that had been carefully maintained for decades. The paperwork was airtight. The taxes were paid automatically every year. The property surveys were updated regularly. As an engineer, I have always believed documentation solves most problems. If something belongs to you, there should be a record proving it. Standing there outside, I remembered the last conversation I had with Grandpa before he died. We were sitting on the dock watching the sunset turn the lake orange. He told me that land is different from money because money changes hands every day. Land remembers. It remembers who cared for it and who respected it. At the time, I thought it sounded like something an old man would say. Years later, those words came back to me with surprising clarity. Because the people inside were treating the lake house like a convenient building. To me, it was a living piece of family history. A burst of laughter erupted from inside again. Somebody dropped a stack of papers. I heard chairs scrape across hardwood floors that my father had refinished himself 15 years earlier. Every sound felt personal. I slowly walked around the side of the house toward the lake. The shoreline remained exactly as I remembered. The wooden bench overlooking the water was still there. So was the small brass plaque my father installed after Grandpa passed away. Family first. Those 2 words were engraved into the metal. Looking at that plaque while hearing HOA employees conduct business inside my home created a strange feeling in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something more focused. The kind of feeling you get when you realize a situation is much bigger than a misunderstanding. Because misunderstandings usually come with apologies. This operation looked organized, deliberate, permanent. As I rounded the corner toward the back deck, I noticed something else that made me stop. Mounted beside the rear entrance was another electronic lock. Brand new. The second one. They had not just entered my property. They had invested money into controlling it. The lake reflected the fading sunlight behind me as I stood there staring at that keypad. And for the first time since arriving, one question finally pushed through all the confusion. How long had they been doing this? The answer arrived sooner than I expected. As I stood near the back deck, the sliding glass door suddenly opened, and a man stepped outside carrying a cardboard box filled with folders. He nearly walked straight into me. The look on his face was priceless. He froze. I froze. For a second, we simply stared at each other while the evening wind rustled through the trees. "Can I help you?" he asked. Not hello. Not who are you. Can I help you? As if I were the visitor. The question told me everything I needed to know. Whoever was working here had been taught that this property belonged to the HOA. I glanced at the box in his hands. Membership records, violation notices, financial reports. The entire operation appeared to be running from my lake house. "Actually," I said calmly, "I was about to ask you the same thing." The man shifted uncomfortably. Before he could answer, another voice called from inside. Diane Whitmore appeared in the doorway. The moment she saw me, her expression changed. Not surprise, not confusion, irritation. The kind of irritation people show when an unexpected inconvenience interrupts their day. She stepped onto the deck with the confidence of someone who believed She controlled the situation. "Mr. Walker," she said, "you are back earlier than expected." Earlier than expected. The words landed harder than they should have. I had never informed the HOA about my schedule. I had never asked permission to leave. Yet somehow she spoke as though my arrival had disrupted plans she already had in place. The scent of expensive perfume drifted through the air as she crossed her arms. Behind her, I could see half a dozen people moving around inside my house. One employee was hanging a bulletin board near the staircase. Another was carrying office supplies into what used to be my father's bedroom. The sight made my stomach tighten. "What exactly is going on here, Diane?" I asked. Her smile appeared instantly. Polished. Practiced. Completely artificial. "The association has been utilizing the facility for administrative purposes." Utilizing the facility. Not borrowing. Not renting. Utilizing. Every word sounded carefully selected by someone who thought language could replace ownership. I looked directly past her into the house. My grandfather's antique fishing rods were gone from the wall. In their place hung framed community guidelines. The old family photographs had disappeared. So had the handcrafted wooden clock my father built 20 years earlier. "Where are my things?" I asked. Her smile never moved. "Stored safely." The answer was immediate. Too immediate. She had expected that question. The lake behind me reflected the fading orange sky, while the first evening insects began humming across the shoreline. Everything around us felt peaceful. Yet something about the conversation felt increasingly wrong. Diane walked a few steps closer. "The board voted unanimously several months ago to establish a permanent administrative center for the community. This location was determined to be ideal. Permanent. There it was. The word I had been dreading. They had not occupied my lake house temporarily. They had decided it belonged to them indefinitely. And who authorized that?" I asked. "The board." She answered as though that settled the matter. "I did not ask who voted for it," I said. "I asked who authorized it." For the first time, her smile weakened slightly. Around us, the sounds inside the house seemed quieter. A few employees had noticed the conversation and were watching through the windows. Diane folded her arms tighter. The property had been sitting and used. I almost laughed. Sitting and used. As if ownership expired whenever someone traveled for work. As if family history disappeared when a building sat empty for a few months. Then she delivered the statement that finally transformed my confusion into certainty. "Honestly, Ethan, the community has gotten more value from this property in 6 months than your family did in decades." The words hung in the air between us. Behind her, inside the house my grandfather built, people continued carrying HOA paperwork through rooms filled with memories they knew nothing about. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with people who genuinely believed community convenience outweighed private ownership. The dangerous part was not that they had entered my property. The dangerous part was that they had convinced themselves they were entitled to it. I looked at Diane for several seconds without saying a word. One thing I learned as an engineer is that people often reveal more when you stop arguing and let them keep talking. Silence makes confident people uncomfortable. Sure enough, she filled it. "The board reviewed the situation extensively," she said. "The property was underutilized. The association needed office space. This solution benefits everyone." Benefits everyone. I glanced toward the lake again. The water reflected the last light of the evening, while a pair of ducks drifted across the shoreline. My grandfather used to sit on that dock every morning with a cup of coffee before work. He paid property taxes on this land for decades. He maintained the shoreline. He repaired storm damage. He built half the structures himself. Yet somehow a group of people holding monthly meetings had convinced themselves they possessed greater rights than the family that actually owned it. "Did it ever occur to anyone to ask me?" I said. Diane sighed dramatically as though I was being difficult. "We attempted communication." That statement immediately caught my attention. Attempted how? Her eyes shifted for the first time. Just slightly. Enough for me to notice. Several notices were sent. Notices. Not requests. Not agreements. Notices. The distinction mattered. I pulled out my phone and opened my email. Nothing. No lease proposal. No request for permission. No contract. No authorization forms. Nothing. I did not receive any notices. Diane shrugged. They were mailed. The answer sounded weak even to her own ears. The air smelled faintly of lake water and fresh-cut grass from a nearby property. Somewhere across the shoreline a boat engine started, and then faded into the distance. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. Yet the conversation felt increasingly absurd. "You mailed notices to a property you were already occupying?" I asked. A couple of HOA employees standing inside exchanged nervous looks. Diane ignored them. The board followed procedure. That phrase appeared to be her entire defense. Procedure. Not ownership. Not permission. Procedure. I slowly walked past her and looked through the open doorway. Every room showed signs of permanent occupation. Filing cabinets. Printers. Storage shelves. Office furniture. Someone had even installed a reception desk near the entrance. The reception desk sat directly on top of a handmade rug my grandmother bought 30 years ago. The sight tightened something inside my chest. Then I noticed another detail. Near the hallway stood a stack of cardboard boxes labeled Walker Family Storage. My name. My family's name. Written on boxes like inventory. Like we had become an inconvenience to be packed away and moved aside. "Where are those being stored?" I asked. Diane followed my gaze. "A rental facility in town." I nodded slowly. "You moved my personal property into storage. For safekeeping. Without permission." Her smile disappeared completely. The employees watching through the windows suddenly looked fascinated by anything except the conversation. One pretended to organize papers. Another stared at a computer screen that was obviously turned off. They all understood where this was going. Diane was the only one still pretending everything was normal. Then she made a mistake. A very important mistake. "The association has invested significant resources into this facility," she said. "Removing operations now would create unnecessary disruption." There it was. The real concern. Not legality. Not fairness. Convenience. They had become comfortable. Comfortable enough to forget whose name appeared on the deed. Comfortable enough to replace locks, relocate personal property, and convert a private residence into corporate office space. Comfortable enough to assume the owner would never return. I looked around one final time. The printers humming in the background. The fluorescent office lights glowing through windows that once overlooked family barbecues. The binders. The signs. The golf carts. Every single detail represented months of planning. None of it happened by accident. Diane crossed her arms again. "I hope we can handle this reasonably." I smiled for the first time since arriving. Not because anything was funny. Because a piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. Reasonable people ask permission before moving into someone else's property. Reasonable people do not replace locks they do not own. Reasonable people do not pack away another family's history and call it community improvement. As the last sunlight disappeared behind the trees, I realized something important. Diane believed she was negotiating from a position of strength. She thought the offices, equipment, and employees inside gave her leverage. What she did not understand was that every printer, every desk, every filing cabinet, and every person sitting inside that building depended on one simple fact. They all needed access to a property that still belonged to me. I left the property without another argument. That surprised Diane. I could see it in her face as I walked back toward my truck. She expected a confrontation. She expected demands, threats, maybe a dramatic scene on the front lawn. Instead, I simply drove away. The gravel road disappeared behind me while the last traces of daylight faded across the lake. The entire time, one thought kept circling in my head. People who believe they own something usually leave evidence behind. By the time I reached town, the courthouse was already closed, but county property records were available online. I checked into a small motel, ordered a stale cheeseburger from the diner next door, and opened my laptop. The smell of burnt coffee and old carpet filled the room while I started digging. Within 20 minutes, I found the first interesting detail. The Lakehouse deed had never changed ownership. Not once. The property remained exactly where it had always been, under the Walker family trust with me listed as the controlling beneficiary. No transfer. No lease. No easement. No agreement. Nothing. Legally speaking, the situation was crystal clear. Yet that only raised a bigger question. How had the HOA convinced itself this arrangement was legitimate? Around 10 o'clock that night, I found part of the answer. Buried in 6 months of HOA meeting minutes posted on the community website was a reference to the Lakehouse. The language was intentionally vague. Community Asset Utilization Initiative. Temporary administrative relocation. Enhanced resource management. The kind of corporate wording designed to hide simple facts. They never called it private property. They never mentioned my name. They never mentioned ownership. Instead, they described the building as though it were a community resource waiting to be activated. I kept reading, meeting after meeting, month after month. Then I found Diane's comments. She appeared constantly throughout the records. According to the minutes, she repeatedly argued that underused assets should serve the broader community. She pushed for expansion, more office space, more storage, more administrative functions. The Lakehouse appeared in nearly every discussion. The pattern became obvious. This had not been a spontaneous decision. Diane had been steering the board toward my property for months. The next morning, I visited the storage facility she had mentioned. The place sat on the edge of town between a hardware store and an auto repair shop. A middle-aged manager named Carl greeted me at the front desk. The smell of motor oil drifted in every time the front door opened. When I gave him my name, his eyebrows immediately rose. "Walker?" he asked. "The Lakehouse Walker?" I nodded. He stared at me for a second before disappearing into the office. When he returned, he carried a clipboard. "You should probably see this." 10 minutes later, he rolled open a storage unit. My stomach dropped. Stacked floor to ceiling were dozens of boxes. Family photographs, fishing equipment, furniture, decorations, books. My grandfather's handmade rocking chair sat in the corner wrapped in plastic. The old wooden clock my father built was leaning against a wall beside several framed family portraits. They had packed away decades of memories like excess office furniture. Dust floated through the sunlight pouring in from the open unit door. I walked slowly through the contents, recognizing item after item. Then Carl handed me a copy of the rental agreement. The renter's name was not the HOA. It was Diane Whitmore personally. I read it twice just to be sure. Personally, not professionally, not organizationally. Personally. The paper felt heavier in my hands than it should have, because suddenly the situation looked very different. If the board had approved everything, why was Diane paying for storage herself? Why was her name attached to the contract instead of the association's? The answer arrived immediately. Because she understood exactly what she was doing. The board may have been careless. The employees may have been misled. But Diane knew the property belonged to someone else. Otherwise, there would have been no reason to hide the transaction. I thanked Carl, photographed every box, every label, every item, and every document. By noon, I had enough photographs to fill an entire folder. As I drove back toward the lake, the smell of fresh rain drifted through the open window. Dark clouds were gathering above the water. For the first time since returning home, I stopped feeling confused. I stopped feeling shocked. In its place came something far more useful. Clarity. Diane believed she had built a permanent headquarters. What she had actually built was a paper trail. The rain arrived just after sunset. Thin drops tapped against the windshield as I parked across the street from the Lakehouse and watched the lights glow through the windows. The place looked less like a family home now and more like a small corporate office. People moved from room to room, carrying folders and laptops. The printer hummed. Phones rang. Cars came and went from the driveway. The entire operation depended on one assumption. They believed nobody would challenge them. The next morning, I met with an attorney named Rebecca Collins. She specialized in property law and had spent 20 years untangling disputes involving easements, ownership claims, and unauthorized use of private land. The smell of old paper and fresh coffee filled her office as I spread photographs, county records, storage contracts, and HOA meeting minutes across her conference table. She reviewed everything carefully without saying much. Every few minutes, she would make a note in the margin of a document. Occasionally, her eyebrows lifted. Eventually, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "This is one of the strangest cases I have seen in years," she said. "Strange good or strange bad?" I asked. A small smile appeared. "Strange good if you are the owner." She tapped the deed first, then the storage agreement, then the HOA meeting minutes. They never obtained a lease. They never obtained written permission. They never purchased the property. And based on these records, they appear to have invested association funds into a building they do not control. The words felt like fresh air after days of confusion. Rebecca continued reviewing the evidence for another hour. When she finished, she organized everything into neat stacks. "The most interesting part is not what they did," she said. "It is what they failed to do." I asked her what she meant. She slid the deed toward me. "They forgot ownership still matters." That afternoon, I returned to the county records office. I wanted to verify every detail personally. If this situation eventually reached a courtroom, I wanted to know the facts better than anyone else. The clerk behind the counter helped me pull archived surveys, tax records, and trust documents. Every page told the same story. My family had owned the property continuously for decades. No transfers, no liens, no administrative claims. No legal mechanism existed that gave the HOA any authority over the Lakehouse. Around 3 o'clock, I found something else. Several permit applications submitted by the HOA referenced the Lakehouse as their administrative headquarters. The applications carried Diane's signature. That detail mattered because every form required the signer to certify they possessed authorization to use the property. I photocopied every page. The stack of documents grew thicker by the hour. By evening, I sat alone on a bench overlooking the lake. The air smelled clean after the rain. Water dripped from the trees while sunlight broke through the clouds and painted the shoreline gold. Across the lake, I could see the Lakehouse. Employees were still working inside. The office remained busy. Cars filled the parking area. Someone had even placed decorative flower planters beside the entrance. They were improving property they did not own. The irony was almost impressive. My phone buzzed. It was Rebecca. "I have a question," she said. "Do you know who installed the electronic locks?" I told her I did not. She laughed softly. "Find out." The next morning, I visited a local security company whose logo appeared on a small sticker attached to the rear keypad. The owner recognized the installation immediately. He pulled up the invoice on his computer. Diane Whitmore had personally approved the work. She paid extra for remote access controls and commercial-grade management features. I requested a copy of the invoice, and he provided it without hesitation. As I walked back to my truck, the morning sun reflected off the lake in the distance. My folder now contained deeds, surveys, contracts, invoices, permits, photographs, and storage records. Piece by piece, the picture had become impossible to ignore. Diane had not accidentally crossed a line. She had spent months building an entire operation around the assumption that nobody would ever challenge her decisions. What she did not realize was that every new document she signed created another thread. And now all those threads were beginning to connect. 3 days later, I stopped gathering evidence and started preparing a solution. Not a confrontation, not an argument, a solution. That distinction mattered. The entire situation existed because Diane and the HOA had spent months pretending ownership did not matter. My response would remind them that it did. Rebecca and I met one final time in her office overlooking Main Street. Morning sunlight spilled through the windows while the smell of fresh coffee drifted across stacks of documents covering the conference table. Deeds, permit applications, storage contracts, security invoices, property surveys. Every piece fit together perfectly. Rebecca reviewed the timeline one last time before sliding a folder toward me. "You have more than enough documentation," she said. "The question is how you want to proceed." I already knew the answer. During the past week, I had spent hours studying every detail of the property. The original locks had been replaced without authorization. The HOA controlled access through electronic keypads they installed themselves. Employees entered every morning using codes distributed by Diane. Deliveries arrived throughout the week. Meetings were scheduled almost daily. The operation ran like clockwork, and that predictability gave me an advantage. Because routines create opportunities. The following Monday, I returned to the lake before sunrise. A light fog hovered above the water while the shoreline remained completely silent. The air smelled like wet cedar and fresh earth. For a few minutes, I simply stood near the dock, watching the sun begin to rise. It reminded me of mornings with my grandfather. Quiet, peaceful, uncomplicated. Then I walked back toward the house. A licensed locksmith was already waiting in the driveway. His truck sat beside the detached workshop while steam drifted from a paper cup balanced on the dashboard. I handed him copies of the deed, identification, and property records. He reviewed everything carefully. "You are the owner?" he asked. "I am." He nodded. "Then tell me what you want changed." We spent the next hour inspecting every entry point on the property. Front door, rear entrance, side access, workshop doors, storage rooms. The locksmith documented existing hardware and prepared replacement systems. Everything was done professionally, legally, quietly, no drama, exactly the way my grandfather would have preferred. By mid-morning, the house remained empty. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for noon. I knew because their schedule was publicly posted online. Around 11:30, vehicles began arriving. Board members carried folders and laptops through doors they believed they controlled. Employees followed. Delivery drivers dropped off supplies. The receptionist unlocked her workstation. Phones started ringing. Printers started humming. Another ordinary day inside my lake house. From a bench near the shoreline, I watched it all happen. Not with anger, with patience. The same patience Grandpa taught me while fishing years earlier. The kind that comes from knowing timing matters. Around 1 o'clock, the meeting was fully underway. Through the windows, I could see Diane standing near the conference table addressing the board. People took notes. Others reviewed documents. Nobody paid attention to the owner sitting quietly beside the lake. Why would they? They had spent months convincing themselves I was irrelevant. That assumption would become their biggest mistake. At exactly 1:15, the locksmith finished his work. New systems were installed. New keys were prepared. Ownership records were documented. Everything was completed according to law and procedure. He handed me a small ring containing several polished brass keys. The metal felt cool in my palm. For a moment, I thought about my grandfather carrying keys that looked almost identical decades earlier. Then I slipped them into my pocket. Across the yard, the HOA meeting continued uninterrupted. Laughter drifted through an open window. Someone carried fresh coffee into the conference room. The office functioned exactly as it had every day before. The only difference was something nobody inside had realized yet. Control of the property had quietly returned to the person who actually owned it. The first sign appeared 20 minutes later. A young employee walked to the front door carrying a stack of outgoing mail. Through the window, I watched her type a code into the keypad. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. Her expression shifted from mild confusion to concern. A second employee joined her. Then a third. Within a minute, 4 people stood clustered around the entrance, staring at a lock system they no longer controlled. From my bench near the shoreline, I could barely hear the conversation, but I did not need to. Their body language said everything. The office that had operated without interruption for months had suddenly encountered a problem it could not explain. A few minutes later, Diane appeared. Even from a distance, I recognized the confident stride. She stepped to the keypad and entered a code herself. Then another. Then another. Nothing. The lock remained silent. The afternoon breeze carried the smell of lake water across the property, while sunlight reflected off the windows of the building she believed belonged to her organization. Inside, employees began moving from room to room. Some checked doors. Others pulled out phones. One person even walked toward the rear entrance. The result was exactly the same. No access. No control. No authority. For nearly 10 minutes, they tried to solve the mystery themselves. Then Diane spotted me sitting near the dock. The moment she saw me, everything clicked behind her eyes. She immediately started walking across the lawn. Fast. Determined. The kind of walk people use when they know exactly who is responsible for a situation. By the time she reached the shoreline, several board members had followed her. "What did you do?" she demanded. Her voice remained controlled, but only barely. I looked out across the lake before answering. A fishing boat drifted slowly in the distance. Birds skimmed the water. The entire scene felt strangely peaceful. I secured my property. Diane stared at me as if I had spoken another language. "You cannot lock us out." That statement almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because she genuinely believed it. Months of unchecked authority had convinced her that ownership was merely a technical detail. "Actually," I said calmly, "that is exactly what an owner can do." The silence that followed was magnificent. Around us, the board members exchanged nervous glances. Some already understood where this conversation was heading. Others still looked confused. Diane folded her arms. "We have operations inside." "I know." "We have equipment inside." "I know." "We have records inside." "I know." Every answer seemed to frustrate her more, because none of those facts changed the one fact that mattered. The property belonged to me. A light wind rustled the trees overhead. Somewhere behind us, an employee unsuccessfully tested another door. The faint electronic beep echoed across the yard. Diane took a slow breath. "This is highly disruptive." There it was again. The same argument she had used from the beginning. Convenience. Not ownership. Not permission. Convenience. Rebecca had predicted this perfectly. People become attached to arrangements that benefit them. even when those arrangements are built on shaky foundations. Diane pointed toward the building. The association invested substantial resources into that facility. I nodded. Without a lease. Her jaw tightened. The board approved it. The board does not own it. Another silence. This one lasted longer. The afternoon sun reflected off the windows behind her. Through the glass I could still see printers, desks, filing cabinets, and office furniture occupying rooms that once held family photographs and fishing gear. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The only thing that changed was control. Eventually Diane asked the question she should have asked months earlier. What do you want? I reached into my folder and handed her a document. Then another. Then another. Property records. Storage agreements. Permit applications. Security invoices. Photographs. The evidence she had spent months creating. Her expression changed as she reviewed the pages. Confidence faded first. Then certainty. Then something that looked very close to realization. Because for the first time since I returned home, Diane was no longer arguing with me. She was arguing with paperwork. And paperwork has a way of winning those conversations. The aftermath moved much faster than Diane expected. Within 48 hours, the HOA attorney contacted Rebecca. Within 72 hours, the board held an emergency meeting at a rented conference room downtown because they no longer had access to the building they had been using. The irony was almost poetic. The organization that spent months treating private property like community space suddenly found itself searching for a temporary office. The smell of fresh paint greeted me when I finally walked back into the Lakehouse alone. Real silence filled the rooms for the first time since my return. No ringing phones. No printers. No keyboards. Just the faint creak of old floorboards settling beneath my boots. Sunlight poured through the windows, overlooking the lake. Dust drifted lazily through the air. For a moment, I simply stood there and listened. The house felt like itself again. During the following week, moving trucks arrived. Not because I forced anyone out in dramatic fashion. The board's own legal advisors quickly realized the evidence was impossible to defend. The permit applications, the storage contracts, the unauthorized lock replacements, the meeting records. Every document pointed in the same direction. One afternoon, I watched from the dock as employees carefully removed desks, filing cabinets, and office equipment. Most looked embarrassed. A few actually apologized. Several admitted they genuinely believed the property belonged to the association. That part surprised me the least. Diane had spent months presenting fiction as fact. People tend to trust authority until paperwork proves otherwise. My family's belongings returned next. Box after box arrived from the storage facility. The old rocking chair went back beside the fireplace. Family photographs returned to the walls. My father's handmade clock reclaimed its place above the mantel. Every item felt like a piece of history finding its way home. The sweetest moment came when I rehung my grandfather's fishing rods exactly where they had always been. Standing there, I could almost hear his voice telling me to keep things simple and let facts do the heavy lifting. Diane, meanwhile, faced a very different reality. The board launched an internal review after discovering how many decisions had been approved without proper documentation. Questions spread quickly. Members wanted explanations. Homeowners wanted answers. Financial records received scrutiny they had never faced before. I never needed to attack her reputation. The documents handled that part on their own. Months later, Rebecca called with an update. The association had reached a formal settlement covering storage expenses, restoration costs, and several other issues created during the occupation. The details mattered less than what happened afterward. New board elections were scheduled. New oversight procedures were implemented. Most importantly, the culture of blind authority began to change. One autumn evening, nearly 6 months after everything ended, I sat on the dock watching the sunset paint the lake orange and gold. The same bench, the same shoreline, the same water my grandfather loved. A gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar across the property. The house behind me glowed warmly in the fading light. It looked exactly the way it should have looked all along. Not an office, not a headquarters, not a community asset, a family home. I thought about the first day I returned and saw that HOA sign hanging beside the front steps. At the time, the situation felt unbelievable. Looking back, the lesson was surprisingly simple. Most people think power comes from titles, committees, votes, or official-looking paperwork. Real power comes from facts. Facts do not care who sits in the president's chair. Facts do not care how many meetings someone runs. Facts do not care how confident a person sounds when they claim authority they do not possess. Ownership remained ownership. The deed remained the deed. The truth remained the truth. As darkness settled across the lake, I heard the familiar sound of water tapping gently against the dock. The same sound I heard as a child. The same sound my grandfather heard decades earlier. Land remembers, he used to say. Standing there beneath the evening sky, with my family's home finally restored, I realized he had been right all along. Justice is not loud. It does not need to shout. It simply waits for the moment when the facts are finally allowed to speak.